Hello, everyone. At the time of recording today's expert insight conversation, two important Meta lawsuits have just been decided. In New Mexico, the state attorney general, Raul Torres, successfully argued that Meta failed to protect children from sexual predators and also failed to warn users about the dangers of its platforms, winning $375 million for the thousands of violations Meta incurred. While in California, Meta was found liable for $4.2 million and YouTube for $1.8 million for the harmful effects of their addictive design on a single plaintiff. For 2 decades now, social media platforms have relentlessly been exploiting our children for profit, and the result is a national emergency in child mental health, with thousands of children who have been harmed, hospitalized, or even died. These companies do not care about our children, and sadly, lawmakers have been too slow in ensuring social media, like other consumer products, is safe by design. The verdicts in California and New Mexico are an overdue indictment of big tech, and now lawmakers must act to ensure these consumer products are safe by design. I believe that we're just at the forefront of seeing companies finally being held accountable for the human harms they've long known exist in their systems. We also know that they will continue to fight back because trillions of dollars are at stake. And at Mama, we're in it for the long haul. I know this can feel daunting, but it's important to remember that we can each affect change, starting in our communities, our school districts, and in our states. Mama has a national network of chapters, so if you're interested in joining or starting one, you can find more information on our website, wearemama.org. But for today, in this moment, we can start to fight back by getting educated on these products, which is why our conversation today is such an important and timely one. I am delighted to welcome our guest, Dr. Cara Alaimo. She's a communication professor at Fairleigh Dickinson University, where she created the university's academic programs in social media. For the last decade, she has been writing opinion and analysis pieces for CNN about how social media is affecting people. Her book, Over the Influence: Why Social Media is Toxic for Women and Girls and How We Can Take It Back, explains how social media is affecting every aspect of the lives of women and girls and what we can do about it. And she is a former spokesperson in the Obama administration and communicator at the United Nations, who speaks frequently to educators, students, and parents in schools about how to handle kids' social media use. Cara, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
So I understand that you were initially motivated to write Over the Influence when you were starting to consider how to manage your own daughter's social media use. Can you share what your initial concerns were?
Sure. So I have two young daughters. My oldest is still in elementary school, but I think that is not too early to start thinking about these things. There's this old saying that we write the books that we need to read. And so I initially wrote my book trying to find answers for how I would handle my own daughter's social media use. And after it was done, I went for a walk with my CNN editor at the time. And she and I basically had a big laugh about how naive I had been to think that my biggest problem was going to be handling my own daughter's social media use. Because really, the shocking realization that I came to when I was doing this research is that my biggest problem, of course, is that my daughters are going to live in the world that social networks have wrought. And one of the many things that I think is happening is that social media is making offline spaces less safe for women and girls. So, for example, you may know that it is a common part of youth culture in places like TikTok to quote unquote joke about violently abusing women and girls. And that's really unique compared to other forms of extremism in the sense that American teenagers are not generally on TikTok joking about things like beheading people. And I think that it's normalized this idea that this kind of rhetoric and this kind of violence is okay. And we see that spilling over offline in all sorts of statistics. The CDC's most recent youth risk behavior survey showed a significant increase in the percentage of girls who said that they had been forced to have sex. And that is unsurprising to me if you look at what teenagers of all genders are seeing on social media right now. So that's my problem, that my daughters are going to live in this world.
I had similar experiences with my sons, seeing some content that they were exposed to on social media when they were just 10, 12, 13 years old, seeing things that I wouldn't want them to see even as adults. And when discussing with them turning to me and saying, well, that's just normal now, when it doesn't lay the groundwork for any kind of healthy relationship with other people. So, you've written regularly about the effects of social media on kids and society. So I'm really curious to hear what your research has turned up about kids online in general.
Yeah.
Can you tell me about that?
So, one of my most recent research projects was surveying kids at, I think, pretty much the last place on earth we can find kids without screens and social media most of the time, which is summer camps. So, last summer, I did surveys of summer camp counselors at three sleepaway camps. And I surveyed them about their mental health at the start of summer. So, at a period when they'd been using social media a ton, and then 8 weeks later, when they'd largely put social media and their phones away. And I'm just submitting this to academic journals, but I mean, I can tell you the results were drastic. There were significant reductions in anxiety and improvements in their overall mental health. And that's unsurprising to me. There's so many different facets of this, but one thing that I have seen firsthand as a professor, so I started teaching full time in 2014. And I can tell you that just over the last decade or so, there's been a huge shift in the ability of the average student to think critically, to read a book, to understand complicated prose, to have an argument based in logic. And obviously, that's a big generalization, and there's plenty of students who can still do that. But there's been a big shift. And I think a big problem is the lack of focus and distraction. Research tells us that the average kid is getting over 200 notifications on their phone each day. And we know that it takes our brain a lot of time to switch tasks, to disengage, focus on the notifications, switch back. And so all of that is leaving kids exhausted and unable to focus. And I also think that kids are missing out on so many of the most delightful and important things in life, including lost sleep because they're scrolling under the covers, and including face-to-face time with their friends, which is one of the most important things in the world for their long-term health and well-being.
Constant onslaught of information is not healthy for any brain, including adults. And I think for children, it's even harder. And certainly with the high volume of content that is designed to elicit extreme emotions because it's violent or it's meant to be provocative, I think also contributes to the exhaustion. So those are things that affect all human beings, adults or children. One thing I'm curious about because of the book that you wrote is how are girls affected differently by social media than boys?
So in a number of different ways, often girls use social media more than boys, and girls are more relational. So they care more about the so-called friend drama that happens online. When I do assemblies to middle schoolers and high schoolers, I often put a picture on my screen of a bunch of kids at a party. And I say to the students, these are your best friends, and you're scrolling on Instagram, and you see this. How do you feel? Obviously, students are panicked, they're upset, they're outraged, they weren't invited to this party. But one of the things that we talk through is how on social media, we might see an image, but we lack the rest of the context. And so our brains are filling in that context for us. And I like to brainstorm with students what are some of the other reasons why this photo could have come about, right? They were all assigned to work together in a group project and they just finished it. Their parents are all friends. One of their parents, took half their friends who they could fit in their car to an event this week, and you're going to be invited next week. And so kids of all genders are susceptible to feeling really, really badly about the friend drama that happens online. But because girls care more and tend to be more relational, it can affect them really strongly.
I mean, I've lived through that and I've held friends, parents, friends while they're crying because their kids were so devastated to see in real time that they weren't included in a party, for example, thanks to the Snap Map. And, not being included and having to deal with rejection is part of life, and we all go through it. It's just this technology has meant that it's not something you're dealing with occasionally or in a small proportion to everything else, but it's continuous and it's ongoing, and in real time you can know that you're missing out on stuff, and it's just so incredibly painful. I mean, the focus of your work is on women and girls, and I know that social media has been linked to serious mental health struggles in girls. Can you sort of walk us through how that actually happens? I continue to hear questions from people about causation, and they don't always understand the causation. Can you help explain that?
Absolutely. So, I once received an email from a woman who asked me to call her Vivian. She wrote to me after reading one of my CNN columns and said, I got my eating disorder on Instagram as a teenager. So here's how it happened. Vivian was 15 years old when Instagram launched. She was an early adopter. She was really into yoga. So one day she posted a picture of herself doing a handstand. And that picture was picked up by a so-called Fitspo or fitness inspiration page, which led her down this toxic rabbit hole of Fitspiration content. And if you know anything about eating disorders, it's unsurprising that even after years of intensive treatment, she is now a woman in her 20s who continues to struggle with eating issues. Vivian also works part-time as a personal trainer. And she told me that often her clients will pull out their phones, pull up Instagram, show her pictures of the so-called Instagram body, and say, I want to look like that. If you're not familiar, the Instagram body is sort of the wide hips, the flat tummy. And Vivian and I both know that human beings don't tend to naturally look like that. Attaining the Instagram body typically requires surgery. In fact, the procedure with the highest mortality rate of any cosmetic procedure. But that's just not obvious to any of us, but especially kids who are bombarded with all of these images and walk away from these platforms thinking like there's something wrong with their bodies and with their lives because everyone else is having so much fun and they're home like doing their homework after school, which is of course what everyone else is probably doing in their class as well, but doesn't appear that way from what they're seeing online.
So, you know, as if the harms around our kids' physical well-being wasn't enough and emotional well-being, there are growing concerns now about girls and boys forming emotional attachments to chatbots. How real do you think that risk is, and what do you think parents should know?
I wrote about this recently for CNN. I can promise you it's happening. I think that part of the problem is that we're living in what Marisa Franco calls a friendship famine. And so there's this misconception among parents, unfortunately, that kids want to spend all their time on social media. Actually, the researcher Dana Boyd talked to American teenagers and they told her they would much rather get together with their friends face to face. The problem is that often their parents don't let them, right? And they don't have transportation and their lives are overscheduled. So, one of my big messages to parents is that we have to find ways to allow our kids to get together face to face, obviously safely. And I'm always telling parents, like, you might think that your daughter is safe if you're in the kitchen cooking dinner and she's upstairs in her bedroom. But if she's connecting with a predator on Instagram, she's so much less safe than if you just let her get together with other 15-year-olds in the first place. So because kids like lack these friendships and even sometimes the social skills to figure out how to navigate a friendship in person, it's easy to see why they're turning to chatbots. And chatbots really prey on our vulnerabilities because they tend to be designed to tell people what we want to hear. And of course, if you have a good friend, that person will tell you, I think you're wrong about that, or I think that would be a mistake. In fact, it's like one of the most vital things our friends do for us. But chatbots won't do that. Chatbots reinforce our thinking. So, of course, it feels great to be told you're right and you're fabulous all the time, and you can see why kids get wrapped up in them.
And
Um,
adults.
yes, that's
The
true. Um,
sycophancy is really appealing to all human beings.
Totally. But it's really unhealthy, and we certainly can't trust the advice that these chatbots might give our kids. And so, just one thing I would say, and I find myself falling into this trap as well, is to make sure that when you're talking to your kids, you remember that things like Alexa are devices and not people, right? So if I say to my kids, like, ask Alexa, what the weather's going to be tomorrow, or what did she say? I'll say, wait, that's a program, that's not a person.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we would like to see is that we outlaw the ability of these machines to refer to themselves as people, to use words like
Yeah.
I, or to use what I call mom words and say things like I love you and you're so great. That's a human thing. And I don't think we should allow these machines, these zeros and ones, to talk to our children that way. But going back to what you just said about how parents see their children interacting with technology, is there examples you can give or signs they should be on the lookout for when technology use crosses into something more serious, like disordered eating or depression or an unhealthy, inappropriate relationship with a chatbot? And aside from the signs, what should they do?
Yeah. So I asked a psychologist this when I was researching my book. And of course, the problem is that the signs they give you, right? They're isolating more than usual. They're moodier than usual. Well, that can be very typical teenage behavior. And so I think, obviously, you're looking out for those things, but I think one of the best things to do is to stay in constant communication with your kids about what they're seeing on social media, if they're using it, and how they're interacting with technology. And I always say to parents, like, shock your kids if they're already on social media. After dinner tonight, say, let's sit down and scroll on TikTok together. And obviously, you'd get a sense of the types of content that are being served up to your child, which would be very interesting. But it's also the case that, as we all know, algorithms are designed to show people what they think we want to see. And so, if you search for healthy content with your kid wants to be a veterinarian, so you consume content from zoos around the world together. Then all of a sudden, when you're not around, they're more likely to be shown that content. But I do think the trick, besides looking out for some of these signs, which can be really ambiguous, is staying in conversation with your kids about what they're consuming, how it's making them feel, and what changes you might need to make as a result. In terms of the what can we do about it, I think a lot of it is talking through opportunity cost, right? What else could we be doing with our time? How do we reduce our screen time? And then obviously reaching out to school counselors and or a therapist if you need more help. I think, fair to say most parents are struggling with this.
When we started Mama and kind of collected all the data that was available, we created a fact sheet, and we have to regularly update because the we have to regularly update it because the data unfortunately just keeps getting worse and worse. And one of the things that we now know to be true is that while our kids are sometimes interacting with other children online, they actually face the danger of interacting with online predators. Girls in particular face some unique dangers from online predators. Can you say more about what is happening and how that happens to children?
Yeah, I recently reported for CNN on a preliminary study presented at the American Academy of Pediatrics conference that looked at child victims of sexual abuse at a particular hospital in California. And unsurprisingly, an increasing number of those children met their predators online. So, as we all know, like when we were growing up, our parents were probably worried about us meeting a predator at a park, right? If we were on our own. Now, those predators are largely online, and they're on social networks where they target kids. And it's on the social networks your kids are on and on the games that your kids are on. And, often they'll establish an emotional relationship. They know how to prey on kids' vulnerabilities. And then they convince them to meet or they convince them to share an intimate image. And then they might catfish your child, is another possibility, right? So your child shares one intimate image, and the next message that comes through is Venmo me $25,000 in the next hour, or I am sending this to, and then a list of the names of your classmates and friends and parents. And that's really scary.
The crime of sextortion has just gone up and up and up. And for those listening or viewing who are unfamiliar, it's just as Kara described, where they will sometimes convince a child to send a nude image and then tell them if they don't pay that they will share it with everybody they know. Sometimes they continue to threaten the child even after they pay and ask for ever larger sums of money. And sometimes they're relatively small sums of money. I know of one child who died by suicide after he was asked for $300 and didn't want to tell his parents. And so, there's so many terrible stories like this about kids that result to self-harm or suicide in a scary situation like that. What can parents do? What do you recommend they do to educate kids about how this can happen and what they should say in case, God forbid, their child finds themselves in a dangerous situation online?
So I think it is really important to talk to kids about why we never share intimate images. And the reason is because even if we think we could trust the other person, we can't trust technology. So we can't trust that they won't be hacked, etc. The two other most important things we can tell our kids, I mean, the kinds of things that could save their lives, are one, that they should only post on private accounts, not public accounts. And they should make sure that the people whose friend and follow requests they accept actually created those accounts. So they get a new follow request from a classmate. They bump into them in the hallway the next day and say, "Hey, I just want to verify that you created that account, that you sent me that request." And you should go through and see who you've accepted already and confirm who they are. And then the second, probably most important thing I could ever say to a parent is to make sure that your kids know that if they disregard everything you've agreed and they break all the rules and they get into trouble online, they can come to you for help without fear of draconian consequences. Because there are so many kids who haven't gone to their parents because they're afraid of their parents taking their phones away. And I think that we have to model that when our kids mess up in other situations as well, so that they know that they can always come to us. Often, when I go to speak at schools, I speak to the kids in an assembly and the parents, and I tell the kids, in the like when I speak to your parents tonight, I am going to tell them that, they have to tell you this, and I want you to have this conversation with your parents as well. And I also tell kids, to think of a trusted adult, if it's not a parent or guardian, who they could go to in a situation like that and have that initial conversation and agreement so that if they get into trouble online, there's no second thoughts. They have a plan for what they're going to do.
And that they should do that. They should always ask for help and not feel like it's their fault or worry about the consequences, because the number one thing is to get help in that situation and not think that they have to deal with it alone. I think that's what's so terrifying in those situations. So, are there particular platforms that our viewers should be aware of that are more harmful for girls than others or more harmful for boys than others? I mean, are there platforms that you think should be off limits entirely?
So platforms are constantly changing. So it's hard to stay on top of all of the changes as a parent. But one thing I would say is that I think it's a really great idea to keep kids of all genders away from the visually oriented platforms like Instagram, where the focus is on people's appearances, on their faces, and on their bodies. Because I think that is particularly toxic, and to have those conversations about why we should never judge anyone, including ourselves, for their appearances, because they're, being bombarded with the exact opposite message on visually oriented platforms. I think it's worth exploring with your child when they're old enough to get social media, what the privacy practices are of different platforms, what the policies and design of different platforms is at the time that they're signing up, and try to weigh your options and think about like what might best serve your child.
For, we've been having this conversation at Mama since we started, and, I have openly shared that I'm not a parenting expert and have made a lot of parenting mistakes and, allowed access to platforms for my children and regretted doing so when I discovered how much risk was involved. So, the framing we like to use now is sort of, at the end of the day, there should be no products given to children that aren't safe for children. It's kind of a lot to ask. We don't hand 5-year-olds chainsaws and then say, don't cut yourself. So, if this is a product that's putting, people in contact with sexual groomers, if it's exposing them to violence or traumatic images, murder videos, like it's probably not a space for kids. Are there other things that you think we should be doing to teach girls and boys to prepare them for the world of social media even before they're old enough to have phones and apps? Like, what are your thoughts about sort of media literacy education, digital literacy education, and when that should start?
Yeah, so, if my daughters were growing up in Finland, they would be learning how to identify manipulated images and how content is designed to affect their emotions at the same time that they learn to read and write. And that education is largely missing from elementary schools in this country. And that is really scary. I think that when our kids are young, obviously, we've been talking about kindness for generations, but I think it's especially important to double down on conversations about being kind because we know that when they join the online world, there's the so-called online disinhibition effect. People will say and do things online they would never have the guts to do to your face. I think it's really important to talk to kids about boundaries. I interviewed a psychologist recently who said, no is a complete sentence, right? When someone asks you for an intimate image, no, I don't do that. And then also just the critical thinking skills, right? So when you hear something in the news or someone claims something, we say, do you think that's true? Like, where could we find more information? And like teaching kids to ask questions and ask for examples and ask whether it's true for everyone are really great skills. To your point about like having regrets and sort of don't we all, I think one of the things that I constantly hear from parents is my kids already have devices, I can't take them away, or I gave my oldest child a phone at X age, so now I have to give it to my youngest child at X age. And I just don't think that's true. I've called on parents to use the recent verdicts that you just discussed at the top of this event in New Mexico and California as a rationale for sitting down with their kids and saying, hey, like now we've got legal verdicts and more data that tell us that spending all this time on a screen is way more dangerous than we knew when we got you this device. So, what changes should we make together to protect you and make sure that you're happy?
So I know you've said before that you think kids should stay off social media until they're 16. Once they do have access, though, how should parents set healthy rules for phones and media use? Are there ways that parents can sort of help? You mentioned earlier, like they can help sit with their kids and help them find healthy content and communities. But are there other tips you have for how parents should set rules and limits?
Yeah, I think it's important to make sure that kids get everything else they need in their lives. So it's important to carve out enough time for sleep. And of course, there's like all this talk, which I'm sure is partly true about, the light on our kids' phones disturbing their sleep, etc. But I recently covered a study that was done in New Zealand for CNN, and the results were really simple. The reason why kids are losing out on sleep because of social media is because they're scrolling under the covers at night. And so it's really simple. You just need a central place, perhaps a locked box, where everyone charges their phones overnight, including, sorry, us as parents. So making sure kids get enough sleep, making sure kids have uninterrupted time for homework is so important. I tell kids, and I'm not being hyperbolic, that if they were to do a homework assignment, without looking at notifications on their phone, they could likely get the same assignment done in an hour that would take them 3 hours if they were toggling back and forth on their phone. Wouldn't you rather have the extra 2 hours to go hang out with your friends or do something fun? And so giving kids distraction-free spaces for their work is really important. Obviously, your kids are going to tell you, but I need to text a friend because I have a question about this assignment and I need to look up something online, etc. And you'll have to make allowances, but to the degree that that's possible, that's really important. Having screen-free spaces where you connect as a family and where they get together with their friends is really important. And so I think, I wish I could print out a blueprint for every family, but every family is so different. Often families will put away their phones at the dinner table. My husband's an ER doctor. He works mostly nights and weekends. I always have my phone at the table when he's not there because if he can step out and FaceTime my daughters for 30 seconds, he does, and then he's part of dinner. And that's a great use of technology, right? So you negotiate these rules with your kids, and then you talk about how reasonable exceptions will be made, right? We don't have phones at the dinner table, but now grandma's sick. We're keeping our phones on the table because if someone calls us with an update, we want to hear it. And your kids will probably have, smart ideas and ask for exceptions, and that's okay. I also really like the idea of thinking about devices as communal, like the refrigerator, and having a central space where you use technology in your house. Micheline Doucleff wrote Dopamine Kids, and she talks about having a central place that's very public where kids use technology. Now, parents of kids with ADHD will tell you that's not possible, but for many families, that can be a great solution.
So, most of this discussion has been around what's happening to our kids and how parents can manage these technologies for their kids. But our children grow up to be adults in the world. And your book talked a lot about how social media is increasingly shaping the world that young women now enter. What are your concerns about how social media in particular has reshaped society?
Yeah, so my book looks at how social media affects every aspect of the lives of women and girls, from the teen years to online dating, to our careers, to how we parent our kids. And there's so much to this. So, one example would be that people definitely target women with misinformation about health, about pregnancy and childbirth. And that's because research shows that women handle the majority of the health scheduling and decisions in our families. So, like a lot of the people who have posted vaccine misinformation online are men writing messages for mothers about what a good mother does. So there's a lot of fake news specifically targeted to women. Women are often at a disadvantage when we use social media to advance our careers. So research shows that when women share their professional expertise on social media, they get fewer followers, fewer reposts, and fewer resulting opportunities than men in their fields. I think that goes back to offline old-fashioned bias, right? When someone pictures an expert, they picture a white man. We can all change that by being mindful of who we follow and by engaging with and amplifying voices that we respect and appreciate. And so there's so much to this.
I also think, it's affecting all of us and sort of what's become normal in our culture in every single respect. Before we go on to questions from our chapter leaders, we talk a little bit about the effects on girls and women, but you've also written about what boys are experiencing online. And now we're seeing the effects on teen boys and young men. As a mother of boys, I'm especially interested in what you've learned there. Can you share some of that?
Yeah, so there was a recent Pew Research Center survey, which I reported on for CNN, that found the vast majority of boys, well over 70% of boys, are seeing this digital masculinity content. So stuff about having muscles, fighting, making money. And that boys who consume that content are unsurprisingly lonelier. They have lower self-esteem, and they are less likely to share their emotions. And that is really troubling. And so, just as, algorithms are showing girls the body image stuff, this is what our boys are seeing online. And if we're going to let boys online, we have to have these conversations, just as we do with kids of all genders, right? About how to find healthy content in communities and how to avoid the toxic stuff.
These algorithms are written for engagement above all else. And so it's given us things like, looks maxing with these people who are, taking a hammer to their own jaws so that they could potentially look more masculine. It's really troubling and unfortunate. One of our Mama chapter leaders is wondering if you could give one piece of advice to a parent of a young daughter about social media, what would it be?
I think it's the advice I would give to a parent of a kid of any gender, and it's to tell them that if they screw up and they get in trouble online, they can come to you without fear of consequences. That one conversation, that one sentence could save your child's life.
That's great. And another chapter leader is curious, at Mama, we're really interested in ensuring all tech products have safeguards the same way we safeguard the food supply or the transportation system. Basically, we want laws that keep kids safe online. Beyond what we can do at home, what do you think we should be demanding from lawmakers and tech companies?
Yeah, I think it's so important for them to age gate and verify ages so that at least older predators are not connecting with children. I think it's really important for them to take responsibility for the content that they are pushing to kids, not push them misinformation, not push them content that is clearly very bad for them. So that would be a great place to start.
This has been such an enlightening conversation, Kara. Thank you so much for taking the time to sit down with me today. We've got your book, Over the Influence: Why Social Media is Toxic for Women and Girls and How We Can Take It Back, in our Mama bookshop, so folks can order it there. And we'll also include a link in the show notes, as well as Kara's websites and all of the articles that you referenced in your conversation. Is there anything else you want to share with our chapter leaders before you leave us?
No, just this was a great conversation, and I'd be delighted to connect with you and speak to your chapters.
Thank you all so much for joining us. Keep an eye out for our next Expert Insight Series talk, which will drop May 14th with Dr. Dana Suskind. I'll be talking to her about kids and AI, which is yet another timely subject. Thank you again, Kara. Thank you all for joining us.